So good afternoon. Good afternoon to everybody. Good afternoon to our fourth speaker of this panel, this webinar. My name is Paolo Quercia. I am a teacher of strategic studies at Perugia University, and I am the coordinator of a think tank called World of Sanctions that is devoted to the study of economic sanctions in their evolution. I will just say a few words to introduce this very interesting panel, this webinar. The title we have been thinking for this conference is Law, Business and Geopolitics, Economic Lawfare as a Strategic Dimension of International Relations. So we put a lot of contents, a lot of words in this title, just try to embrace many things. What we would like to invite our four speakers to discuss. We want to discuss one very relevant but also unexplored, especially in Italy, I would say, topic. That is all the strange and underground hidden connections that do exist between law, between trade, between geopolitics, especially in this phase of the international relations, in the present phase. It's a phase we know, Alberto Serravalle wrote a book about it. We are living in a period of resurgent economic nationalism. We have been discussing a lot also about the future of globalization. We have been talking of deglobalization. And somehow we can see from many things happening in the Mediterranean, a return of the power politics among nations and states. So the questions of put together law, economics, trade, geopolitics is not naive. It's actually everyday things that we see. But we want to explore this a bit further. We know, of course, that states are relying more and more on domestic or international judicial systems and on international economic relations as instruments to achieve a broader political goal, especially calling in the field of security. State security. State security is something that is expanding and going into many other domains. And this is something, well, if we have a look to the US security strategy of 2017, this is very clear how the economic security has been confused with the concept of national security. National security is today mostly for the US, and for this administration is mostly an economic concept. We know, of course, that international system is peculiar, and the states have always made strategic use of economics, of trade, of law, especially in times of war. Even though we know that in times of war, sometimes the legal instruments created in times of war, they have been transformed and used also in time of peace, like it happened, for example, in the US with the Trade with the Enemy Act that is still in force, and actually is the base of the sanctions against Cuba. But it's not only the problem of sanctions. The topic we put for our panel also can be stretched to other things that can be weaponized. Human rights can be weaponized, humanitarian trade, development aid, all things that can be made a political use in the international systems. And there is many signs that this trend is growing. So it's always been a feature of the international system, but the international system we are experiencing we have been experiencing in the last decade probably is more and more than usual, is abusing other domains in order to advance national interest. So where all this is bringing us, where we are going to, we have arrived to the point that we should talk and use concepts like lawfare or economic warfare, or we can still isolate this, the economy, the judicial systems from the big strategic games among states. This, I think, is a big debate we cannot solve in this hour of debate, of course, but it will be, I think, one of the trend of discussing international relations in the coming years. And to explore these topics, I don't go to define what is a lawfare, what is economic warfare. We all have a notion about it. But we are asking to our speakers how we are in this process of politizations, mostly of law and trade, and how much today they are interconnected with strategy and geopolitics. We have four very distinguished speakers. The first one who will take the floor for, I would suggest, 10, 12 minutes. And then we leave eventually the floor, 10, 12 minutes for each speaker, and then we leave the floor to questions eventually. The first speaker is Alberto Saravalle, who is professor of European law at University of Padova and is partner of the law firm Bonelli Erede. And the topic for Avvocato Saravalle is to make a picture of economic nationalism and protectionism, how is the state of the art, where is going this, and what are the consequences for international trade. Please, Alberto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and for inviting me here in this distinguished panel of speakers. I will try, as you said, to just lay the groundwork for further comments, describing where are we currently, what's the status of economic nationalism, which is clearly spreading more and more around the globe. Just take a look at any of the major international newspapers every day, and you see that there are examples that doesn't matter how they are justified. The fact is that the measures are often the byproduct of economic nationalism. Take, for example, the digital war between China and the United States for the control of technology, the latest casualties of which are two apps, TikTok and WeChat, that are widely utilized by teenagers, one, and by Chinese speakers, the other one. And this has given rise to a response from China that supposedly preparing a blacklist, and adopted also these days other measures that may seriously affect the US companies. But in general, economic nationalism has impacted also the control of foreign investments and hasn't spared Italy, which has adopted its so-called golden power legislation. It's a screen on foreign direct investments that has been amended 4 times in the last 3 years, and every time more and more in a stricter way. But again, as you mentioned at the beginning, there is the trade protectionism that is also increasing every day. The war, once again, by the United States with China, but not only, Europe as well. And the notion of what is a national champion, what is a strategic company that is continuously expanding. I should just mention that a few years ago in France, even yogurt was considered to be a strategic asset, a strategic company, when the PepsiCo was attempting to purchase with an hostile takeover Danone. Having said this, I will briefly touch on 3 issues. What are the origins of this new trend, which I would describe, the state is back with a vengeance. The state is back because every day we hear also more state expansion in the economy. So the origins, how this is disguised, the many faces that it has, and finally, briefly, what are the effects of these on the business community and on investments in general. Origins, I guess we can see the world of yesterday as opposed to the world of today. Until 2007, 8, the world was what has come out from basically World War II, a world which favored multilateralism, free competition, European integration, other areas of integration around the world, and in general, there was well, a policy favoring liberalizations since the late 70s after Margaret Thatcher took over in the UK. Privatization was the general word. Suddenly, after 2007 and 2008, all this world has dramatically changed. The crisis, which was initially financial, but that turned into a sovereign debt crisis, at least in Europe, has clearly had a great impact and started a new phase. There are other factors I would just mention, and they are very well known, from the globalization as such, has created, obviously, had an enormous impact, but also technological changes, climate changes, immigration. These had the result of creating uncertainties, insecurities. Obviously, there are winners and losers. Overall, been probably over 1 billion of Chinese moved out of a phase of extreme poverty, but certainly this has had an impact in the Western countries, where especially on the middle class, that maybe it was not necessarily that it happened, but they had the perception of having a greater disequality with respect to the top percentiles and moving closer to the bottom of the scale. So as a matter of fact, of the ladder, as a matter of fact, this has created a favorable environment for populist movement around the world, and not just simply in Europe, to launch their different policies, which have a number of features in common, which we will review in a second. And notably, this is a phenomenon that is not, according to the traditional classification, something which is on the right or on the left, because when we talk about these economic policies, we can find Varoufakis in Greece and the AfD in Germany having more or less the same economic policy: more state, more protectionism, less competition, control on foreign investments, and so on and so forth. So having said this, let me move briefly into what is exactly this phenomenon that I would say in Italian I call it sovranismo economico, in general is economic nationalism, which is generally described as such, but it has many facets. It disguises itself under different features. The general common element of this are, as I said, closing the borders and advancing national interest in different ways. But it can present itself, first of all, as what we would say a sort of state interventionism. The state, I mean, this is something which may be justified nowadays with the pandemic crisis, but be sure that the pandemic crisis is often taken as an excuse, as a pretext to justify a move that was already pervasive, it was already quite widespread. So, and especially the problem is that the state intervention that should be temporary. I mean, for instance, in Europe, they have softened the rules on state aids with temporary framework, but the risk is that this intervention will not phase out as it should. And this is a problem. The second is the screening of foreign investments. This is a global phenomenon. We saw it, for instance, very strongly in the United States, where the CFIUS, which, as some of you may know, dates back from the 70s, 1975, but in the past few years, very few cases were blocked. There have been 4 in the last probably 10 years, 2 Chinese acquisition blocked by Obama and 2 by Trump, but many more which have been so-called voluntarily withdrawn, and the legislation has been amended to become stricter and stricter. Likewise in France and Germany, even UK, which is normally had a policy open for business. And in Italy, as I said earlier, the legislation has been amended 4 times and is now touching even small and medium enterprises. But then again, not only we have state protectionism, which is also protectionism has become the normal thing after especially Trump promoted this protectionist measure. But the interesting thing is that it's not only economically driven. The tariffs have been used, for instance, against Europe to threaten France or other countries that wanted to tax U.S. companies, against Mexico to promote more controls at the border. So tariffs, there have been somehow about 25,000 protectionist measures between 2008 and January 2020. Again, very briefly, I would also mention that there is less competition. Even in Europe, we are trying to, France and Germany and other countries are trying to limit the European rules on competition. There is competition at the level of among countries to attract investments with unfair fiscal policies, what I call unilateralism. And there is more, in general, a sense of what I call anti-globalism, that in a way, another way to bring back the companies in their own country and somehow close the market. To all this, add a strong anti-European sentiment that has been strong, especially in the past few years. After Next Generation EU, probably this is less, something may have changed, but we will see what happened in the world, and certainly much less multilateralism. Let me go to the conclusion and see what are the effects, what's the impact, how is this affecting business? I would say that as a result of this, there are five effects. One, the most important is that there's been a politicization of the business. The politicization in terms that basically we used to look at the fundamentals of a company when approaching a new market and decide whether to invest or to purchase a company. Now you look more at the government. Even when you are investing in a Western country, what is the government? Will it change? What's their protection of foreign investments, vested rights? Who do we know? Who do we speak to? And this obviously opens the door to less transparent dealings, influences, from I would say string pulling, influence peddling, and other things that are not so nice. The second thing is we have a change in the flows of investments. For instance, when China was no longer welcome in America, the flows of investment went to Europe. Now they move even out of Europe to other countries. So that is unhealthy in general, because it's not following business, but it's following the politics of the moment. Three, there is a reshoring of now, especially after the pandemic crisis, we see that everything needs to be produced at home, even the masks or whatever. Which we will never be able to predict what next needs to be produced at home. And I still think that the Ricardo vision of comparative advantages still stands. But four, I mean, even in the localization of plants and factors, now you have to take into account the political, considerations. Lots of European or American companies move from China to Vietnam because they don't want to be stuck, for instance, in a possible war that may affect the future. And finally, last but not least, we are witnessing to a diversification of the technology in 2 or 3, maybe, certainly China and America, who knows whether Europe will be able to be one, area of influence, so that we are going in a direction where there will be suppliers for the Chinese influence area, for America, as we see in 5G or other similar technologies, which will entail higher costs and delays in the development of technologies. It's in a way as if we are assisting to a regionalization in a world which still remains globalized, but with different areas of influence. And this is not certainly positive. Let me conclude by, I am worried with all this, what's happening, because the world is becoming closer, and we have seen this in the past, especially in the 30s. I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I think we should all remember what Bastiat said about when goods don't cross the borders, soldiers will. And we're not there, but we should be wary, because all this nationalism from the economic, it's very short, the difference between economic nationalism, political nationalism, and from there to who knows what. Okay, thank you very much. And I will stop here for the first round.
Thank you to Alberto Saravalle for this very broad and effective picture. So once we settle the picture, we move to our next speaker. We are very glad to have with us Professor Maria Chiara Malaguti. She's professor of international law at University Cattolica del Sacro Cuore, and she is president of UniDroit. And well, she's the right person to address the topics that we mentioned from the law point of view, and especially to bring us the concept of unification of law in the international field, how the unification of law can shape these international relations and can eventually protect us from excessive economic nationalism.
Thank you, Paolo. Yeah, in the first place,
as well for you, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I hope you can hear me. In the first place, indeed, I take you inside UniDroit. This is not my living room, unfortunately. This is the villa where UniDroit is. So you see how nice it is. And in fact, speaking about UniDroit and any other organization working on unification or uniformation of law, in fact, what they do should be exactly the opposite as Lawfare, one way or the other. In fact, some people say that there are friends and enemies of globalization or liberalism, and friends of liberalism should be exactly people who also work on uniformation of law. But I'll try to take you into a journey in the sense that I'm trying to point on up 2 or 3 points, and then you tell me whether indeed these trends that I see make a difference in the picture. And so trying to see how unification of private law, which is something very special, might play a role. Why I'm saying, because I'm not speaking of sanctions, I'm not speaking of barriers, I'm trying to say something different. So to see how possibly some trends in the unification of law, how it is dealt with today, might affect our consideration in general on geopolitics and the role of law into politics. Let me be a bit clear. It's because I think the main point is unification of law is somehow how to defeat nationalism one way or the other. But what we see now is that more and more all those entities that were used to work on unification of law or uniformation of law according to the institution, they now produce more and more soft law instruments. They go for legislative guides, they go for model law, they go for instruments that are not binding 100%, are binding us for the final result, but not us for the way they are implemented. Why? Exactly to address some of the issues that Alberto was mentioning, the fact that states now feel constrained in adopting conventions on this kind of uniformation. and they prefer to keep as much flexibility as they can. But this fact produces a stronger regionalism. So what you see, okay, you see something like the Belt and Road politics, which of course, which is, I would say, 100% private law or economics, but which has quite a political consequence or drive in the way it is conducted. And what is interesting, that in that case you don't speak of lawfare in the sense of defeating your enemy, but choosing your friends against possible enemies. So it is the reverse tool. I choose my friends, I decide who's going to be my friend to insulate one way or the other, those who are not my friends. I mean, the economic colonialism is absolutely nothing new. What is new, I think, in this case is the public-private partnership that you have. So you do use private law tools for this kind of let's say colonization, even if I don't like the word. I mean, this way of getting new friends, let's say. And somehow also the instruments of unification of law might help. The UNCITRAL has adopted a legislative guide on private-public partnerships, and these are used for the Belt and Road. So, you know, and the way these were negotiated, I took part of this negotiation, and I can assure you that there is a lot of politics in the way they try to establish some principles, especially when you have to deal with public and private together. So you have to find a balance and rules that might apply to this cooperation, especially when the public is not the public of your own country, but is the public of another country. Because if you speak of sovereign funds, for instance, you are speaking of a private instrument used for in the sovereign territory of another country. So, but you know, the Belt and Road phenomenon is not even so new in my understanding. What I think is more interesting is the kind of regionalism that you have with FTA agreements or with some direct investment agreements. What you see, take the case of FTA, you do see applied some of the principles that you also have at multilateral level. So in terms of principles, they are the same, but they are applied geographically in a different way. I leave to Antonio Parenti later on to speak of the European Union, so I don't want to touch upon that. But if you consider that some of the same principles are in an agreement with Canada, in another agreement with Vietnam, in possibly another agreement with Japan, this means this same body of principles, but applied in a fragmented way, you know. So it's a multilateralism which is in fact fragmented, and which is also something that you have in investment law. Alberto Saravalle was mentioning the kind of domestic law barriers that you can have to some investments. But you can also look at the same issue, considering how the uniformation of substantive rules on investors, on conditionality, on the way they can make investments in a country, to be indeed also an understanding of how you shape the rules of the game and how you use this kind of instruments for shaping, again, not the lawfare itself, but the step before, one way or the other. And I think that what is interesting in this, Alberto closed saying, how does this affect business? In my understanding, I think it's not only how this affects business, but also how business does play a substantial role in this exercise. You all know, I guess, the Global Compact and all what the private sector decided to undertake in order to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. There are a huge amount of measures which include the direct involvement of private actors in the realization of a policy agenda. So what do you see? You do see that part of the geopolitical choices are made with the private sector, together with the private sector, using the private sector as a tool, or even with some decisions that are directly taken by the private sector, following an agenda that might originally come from their country of origin. So what I'm saying is that also private law and the instruments of private law today have a role in all this, I wouldn't say political use of law. I would say in the typical relationship between law and politics. Until now, we were used of speaking for the most of act of state. Now I think we should move also to consideration on private law. You do have an exercise of unification of private law that should defeat phenomena like nationalism or stronger sovereignist approaches, but that somehow are softened by the kind of use that you do of soft law instruments, which in my understanding are a great tool for unification of law. So I do support the use of these instruments because they give you flexibility. But of course, they also strengthen the use of regional and so geopolitical consideration based on this kind of uniform exercise applied only to a specific region or only with some friends. So what is the final message which I think in this? I think that in all these things that we will discuss today and in this overview, in this panorama that we have on legal instruments, we have to consider today some more hidden way of building up geopolitics, where also the private law plays a role. So just to finish, because I think I'm perfectly in my time if I conclude, unification of law as a tool to defeat lawfare in principle. We are not speaking of war, we are speaking of making war, making economic war by choosing your friends, because in this way you insulate what you consider to be your enemies, and a participation or a different understanding of public and private law today in a way that these tools do play a role. In my understanding, we have a much more articulated world. It's much more difficult to govern this kind of world because of this phenomena. So it is easier one way or the other to speak of lawfare in the traditional way of understanding. It's much more difficult to measure this new phenomena, but in my understanding, they are more solid in their more continuous and probably to some extent a bit hidden in the way they are. I know that I took you into original, let's say, journey, because it's this way of understanding in private law is not the common understanding that we have on law and politics. But in my understanding, there is a lot that can come from studying of this kind of context. I stop here, and then if we have, we can re-elaborate if we have questions or a debate between and among ourselves.
Thank you very much, Maria Chiara, for this for the use of time and the very good concept, how you introduced us to this smart word of unification of law and how it can be useful in the present political situation. Now I will give the floor to Mr. Antonio Parenti, who is the head of the European Commission office in Italy, for showing us how the European Union has to do with all these topics we mentioned, especially how Europe is navigating these troubled waters of economic nationalism, and how it's making use of its normative power, and especially to build and to safeguard, to create the economic alliances with outside the European Union that are so important for our economic development. Please, Mr. Parenti, the floor is yours, 10-12 minutes as the other speakers.
Thank you, Professor Quercia. First of all, I'm delighted to be here with such a distinguished roster of speakers today, but a bit envious of not being in person, especially seeing the backdrop on which you're talking, Professor Quercia. It looks gorgeous there. Not to talk about the premises of Maria Chiara. So it's definitely time to go back to in-person meetings, hopefully soon. This having said, I mean, moving towards the European Union role in the world, and try to make a connection on what you were talking, I would like to take you to a different vision of the European Union. We are very often considered as a gentle power. I think I was in an interview not long time ago, where it was described, European Union described as a gentle power, which is absolutely true. It's a power. It's a gentle. It doesn't make war normally, but it makes standards, which is another way of creating and exerting a fair amount of influence over other countries, and has done so in a very effective way, in my opinion, over the last 30 to 40 years, to the point that you can almost start to see emerging a political or geopolitical design behind it. I exaggerate in calling the European Union reluctant imperialist when it comes to standard, but there is a little bit of a reality in all of this. Normally, we prepare standards for our internal market, and then we send them abroad. And the way to do this is mostly via agreements. I call it reluctant for a very simple reason. The EU was, and at core is still, the champion of multilateralism. But what has happened in the last 20 years, which has been very well described by Professor Serravalle before, is a decreasing relevance of multilateralism. And for an economic power like the EU, the demise of the WTO has been terrible, because that's where we were gearing up and spending all of our energies to foster for forever and ever. The response to this demise, although has not been a quiet response, the European Union has today something like 101 bilateral trade agreement, either in force or being ratified. And they cover basically the entire world, with two major differences: China and the United States. Russia is not included either, but Russia is not a trade power. So let's strike Russia away for a moment. And plus is a net importer of products. So by definition, quite interested in following our rules. What is interesting is, if you look at the pattern of this agreement, you will find the European Union having corralled to a large extent both China and the United States. We have FTA, deep and comprehensive FTA with Canada. On the one hand, we are redoing and strengthening our FTA with Mexico. We have FTA with Japan, one of the most advanced that we have done so far. We have an FTA with all the Asian countries, but China, or we have association agreement, like in the case with Mongolia. So what is the main feature of most of those FTAs? Well, the main feature of most of these FTAs is the request for the recipient countries to largely accept our products and the standard we put in our products. It's far more an acceptance, a request of acceptance of our standards than us being ready to accept their standards. When we look at the agreement with Canada, for example, or the one with Japan, we use the reference to international standards, for example, for cars. But that means normally our standards, the standards that are decided in Geneva, where the European Union counts on 27 votes against one by Japan. The same happens to Canada. So is a mutual recognition of countries vis-a-vis a major bloc on international standardization like the European Union. So the result of all of this is, if you want, that in front and in spite of the major trouble that exists at the international level, we do have a very effective network of agreement that allows our product to free flow internationally, and has maintained the European Union over the last 2 decades, on average and on general, as an economic exporter. We have tremendous, to use Trumpian terms this day, we have a beautiful and tremendous positive balance of trade, with exception of China. Of course, but some countries, some European countries, they even have a positive balance of trade with China. Notably, that was the case for Germany for a long time. So we have been using all of this to foster the capacity of those countries to be resilient vis-a-vis our main international competitor in terms of trade, which is not the United States, but is mostly China. And I say not the United States because with the United States, we have such an integrated economy and a difficult relationship in terms of trade that is difficult to qualify them as a real foe. Even under the current administration, which has not been particularly gentle to Europe, at the end of the day, the tariff and taxes that were imposed on European goods, although not irrelevant, were not of a dramatic relevance. China is more of an issue because with China, of course, we have a growing and fast competition in a number of products which we are also producing. What I also notice more and more, and I think it's worth looking at it for a moment, is the use of all of these agreements for non-trade related goals. Whereas back in the days of the 90s or beginning of 2000, it was almost anathema to anyone to start discussing about social rights or environmental rights when we were talking about trade agreements. Now, if you go and look at the Mercosur agreement, you will find a very strict connection with environment there, to the point that we can stop our trade with the Mercosur if, once this agreement is going to be, of course, ratified, and I think is a big if, what if the environmental standards in Latin America are not respected? You can read Bolsonaro there, and you can read the Paris Agreement, which are two of the priorities of the European Union. And I think more is to come. If you look at the recent migration strategy, which was shown a few weeks ago by the Commission, you can read there that the trade agreements and all the agreements that we're going to have with Africa will entail now a migration aspect. So we will use the overall architecture of our agreements, which of course is trade, in the case of Africa is development and technical assistance and humanitarian aid, to call not only for reciprocal opening to our markets, but also to ask for additional goods. So the European Union, or additional goods or additional deliverables, in this case, would be, of course, migration. So all of this to say that the European Union is using not lawfare, but is using certainly a position of relevance in international relations, and especially a relevance in economic matter. It's what a professor, which is Columbia University professor, which name now escapes me, who calls the Brussels effect, the capacity of using our normative power to force other countries to basically come closer to the European Union. The European Union is using this to foster a number of political goals around the world. And I think that we need to take into consideration that the major risk that we see from this is the fact that China is playing more and more a similar game. We have seen, in fact, and this is very interesting to notice, that China has taken as one of its goals to be able to be in the lead on a number of international UN agencies, which are standard setters. You have Chinese diplomats now adding FAO, adding the International Telecommunication Union, adding the European Economic Agency of the United Nations, which delivers the UNECE, which delivers standards on transport. So it is well understood by the Chinese the importance of standardization. So what a game which has been for very long almost a solo game by the European Union, because the United States has been extremely reluctant ever and ever to impose standards inside his own country and therefore also outside of the United States. A game which has been a solo game, an area which has been for us very easy to control, is becoming an increasingly competitive area also for the European Union. And therefore, I think the European Union may need to look at more traditional ways in the future, legal, but also maybe into more traditional warfare elements to maintain a geopolitical relevance around the world. And I stop here within my 12 minutes.
Thank you to Antonio Parenti. Now we go to the other side of the Atlantic. We move to Professor Jeff Schott, who is a senior fellow of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And he will bring into our discussion this issue of economic sanctions, that is a formidable tools of US economic power, especially for the relevance of the US dollar that has got in the international trade. So I would ask Professor Schott to introduce us the concept of economic sanctions, but in the context of US relations, not only the competitive relations that we are seeing between US and China, but also the relation with the allies, with Europe. Because when the US rely heavily on sanctions, especially those who have secondary sanctions that have extraterritorially outreach, allies and economies who are strictly connected to those of United States of America are strongly affected, even though they agree or not on the political use of this economic instrument. So what is the state of art that this administration is living, the issue of the economic sanctions? And what has this to, how this can change in the coming years? Professor Schott, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to join you in this distinguished panel this afternoon. I wish I could have joined you in person and hope we'll be able to do so in the future. But Paulo, you have really, in your excellent introduction, set the table well for our discussion. And in the limited time I have, I'll only be able to meet some of your expectations, but hopefully put some ideas on the table for our subsequent discussion. The rule of law in international commercial relations has played an important role in the post-war era in protecting the poor against the rich, as well as regulating and constraining relations between powerful nations. The rich largely wrote the rules, particularly the economic rules, and complied with them to avoid riskier exercises in the projection of economic and military force. And that had proven so costly in the first half of the 20th century. So there were lessons for, there are reasons why we have a rules-based international system, the Bretton Woods institutions in particular, but those rules, I should remind, have broad national security exemptions. They were rarely used in the second half of the 20th century. But we now are seeing more frequently the lines blurring between economic and security interests, as Paulo said in his introduction. The Trump administration has conflated the two. Economic security equals national security. But the Trump administration is not the only culprit in using security issues as a pretext for projecting economic nationalism and trying to coerce changes in foreign countries. Now, economic sanctions have been deployed frequently, but mostly in cases where it's big countries versus small countries. And there have been high-profile cases against Cuba, against South Africa, against Panama, North Korea, and of course, major oil producers like Iraq, Iran, Libya, and the Soviet Union and Russia. All of these countries have a very low footprint in the world economy, relatively small traders, small economies, or resource-dependent exporters, where the use of economic sanctions, traditional trade, embargoes could be easily deployed in terms of coercive statecraft. But what we have seen, some of those previous cases were successful, many were not. But what we have seen is what I would call rule erosion from what was set out in the first half of the post-war era to today. Economic rules have become dated. We see that most notably in the trading system, where very little has been added to the trading rule book in the World Trade Organization since the launch of the World Trade Organization in 1995. That's 25 years ago. And just think of how the world has changed and how international commerce has changed, the way way goods are produced, way they're transported, way they're financed. All that has changed, way they're marketed. You didn't get on your cell phone and place orders in those days. So the rule book is behind, and countries have taken it on their own to go to plan B or plan C to try to compensate for the failures to have a common multilateral rule. I think this is what Antonio was talking about in being devoutly multilateral, but recognizing that when you don't have progress on the multilateral level, you have to supplement those initiatives. More troublesome is that the rule of law is giving ground to power-based relations. The US went to war with Iraq, even though there were extensive economic sanctions to try to coerce policy change. Russia seized Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and US and Russian troops are engaged militarily in Syria. And there have been numerous Chinese incidents in this, and the construction of military bases in the South China Sea. all these are very troublesome developments that the pursuit of economic nationalism, as was discussed earlier, increasingly raises the risk of broader military confrontation. Along with this, there has been a changing character in the nature of economic sanctions. From trade and aid embargoes, which were the standard means of economic coercion in the 20th century, that targeted countries, to the new complex of financial controls applied against individuals and entities, and not necessarily against an entire country. This was meant under the banner of smart sanctions to protect the innocent civilians who often got hurt by the comprehensive use of economic sanctions against a country. But those measures have had unintended consequences because not only do they hit the people and the firms that are the target of the sanctions, but they also hit their customers and investors. And in a sense, the regulations for compliance with new economic sanctions is very ambiguous, and intentionally so, because governments, and particularly the US government, wants the private sector to self-enforce. And so if you are worried about whether a business relationship could be subject to sanction under a various act of the United States or another country, you have to go through a lot of legal preparation, due diligence, to ensure that you are not liable to some extensive penalty. And so this is what has happened in the case of US economic sanctions in particular, against Iran, against China, against Syria, against many, many countries. In essence, the sanctions through their enforcement have hit a much larger target of economic coercion, cutting across both friend and foe. And so I take some exception to the thought that we are talking about picking our friends to ally against our foes, because many of the economic sanctions have raised very difficult problems among friends. And that is a big problem. We actually had a first taste of this in the early 1980s with the US sanctions aiming to block construction of the Soviet gas pipeline from the Soviet Union to Europe. That's now being reprised in part with the Nord Stream sanctions, whose enforcement would hit European firms as well as Russian producers. The return of extraterritorial application of US sanctions also is hitting other US allies like Japan, Korea, who are now required to comply with controls on the re-export of US high-tech goods and technologies. This also is hitting the UK and the European Union. Sanctions have also plagued US relations with Europe because of the ongoing actions against Iran, even after the JCPOA. And has also threatened China, a top customer of Iran and Venezuela. And Chinese energy firms, energy trade with Iran and Venezuela has been shielded from sanctions, but those shields in the form of waivers expired in May in 2019. And now Chinese firms and the financial institutions that help them execute their energy trades are now subject or liable to potentially very damaging sanctions. This is all in addition to the broader trade war that I think we all know between the United States and China that was launched on the grounds that China was violating its WTO commitments. In fact, China largely was not violating its commitments, but its obligations in many areas were ambiguous. And so it rather was circumventing rules or exploiting loopholes in the WTO rulebook and taking advantage of the fact that the rule book had not been updated since 1995. As a result, the China trade war, now affecting more than $300 billion of trade, basically launched on the grounds of inadequate rules on subsidies, intellectual property, and investment, led to actions by both the United States and China deploying tariffs that violate their WTO obligations, and feeding the China bashing and new sanctions over other Chinese policies regarding regarding Xinjiang and Hong Kong. And this gets to the issue that we raised before about the introduction of concerns about human rights and pro-democracy. There is a real risk in the escalation of U.S. actions against Hong Kong and Xinjiang. And this could have implications for both U.S. allies and broader ability to use regional and multilateral institutions. The new U.S. law promulgated in July of this year, called the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, requires sanctions against individuals. 11 have been named, including the chief executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, but sanctions against individuals and financial institutions that deal with them. And it risks imposing U.S. sanctions for the first time against global systemically important banks. There really hasn't been any action taken to date that hits the big financial institutions and risks more fracture in the international financial system. And that is what we're facing today, whether Trump is reelected or whether Biden is elected. There's going to be increasing U.S. pressure to act against China. And I should note that this is a little different situation, because in the past there have been major banks that have been hit with fines and penalties for basically doing business with firms that or individuals that have been on the sanctions list. But those banks and financial institutions themselves have not been the direct target of sanctions. That could be something that comes in the near future. That could be very disruptive to international comedy and the ability to promulgate new rules. Now, in my last minute, let me make this point. We need new rules, not only in trade, but in many areas. We needed to set parameters on when a country can invoke national security exemptions from international trade obligations. We need it to prevent sanctions from blocking humanitarian relief. And that's a big problem that we've seen in Iran and many other countries. And we needed to update the WTO to discipline subsidies to state-owned enterprises and in many other areas. But the key problem that arises from this increase of nationalism and hitting friend and foe alike is that it requires cooperation and compromise among the major countries, especially the United States and China. And therein lies the challenge for the next decade. How do you do this when you're increasing the level of friction, but also needing to increase the level of cooperation to deal with climate change, to deal with the pandemic and future pandemics, and to deal with the needed upgrading in the international economic system? Thank you.
Thank you to Professor Schott for your speech. Actually, I think it was very good to finish with your contribution, because it's clear that the world of economic sanction is really the melting pot of economic warfare and lawfare, because this is where they actually meet. Every sanction takes the shape, takes the form of an act, a statute. It's a legal document where these sanctions are based, and courts or legal offices are those that have to deal this brings the big issue of compliance. All the companies to have compliance to these new standards that are created through the legislation in economic sanctions. And even if we see United States, but even also the European Union is very often relying on these measures, especially the smart ones, when we are addressing specific individuals in front of crisis. We have seen this in the case of Belarus. We have seen in the case of Russia just a few weeks ago. It has become quite a constant tool of choice also of the European Union. Of course, for the European Union, this is a sort of obligated path, because what we brought together in our common institutional project is the external trade, is the common trade borders. So it's of course, this is what we unified more. And once we want to have a unified position vis-a-vis another country, we have to rely on these trade instruments more than others that have been left more national. But I really appreciated your contribution. We have still some 5, 6 minutes, 10 minutes for of our conference. So if there are some very short questions that some of the speakers want to address, please, I invite you to raise your hand, to use only a very short time, 30 seconds, 1 minute maximum, to express your point, and please address it to one of the speakers, so he can know to whom you are directing your question. I see for the moment just one of this hand raised. So I can see 2. Are there more? Probably we have only 2. So anyway, I give the floor for the question to Mulik Arman. If you can shortly introduce yourself, and then
good afternoon. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah. Please.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for the panelists for sharing their very intriguing perspectives. My name is Arman Mulic, and I'm a global governance student at the University of Rome Tor Vergata, coming from Bosnia-Herzegovina, actually. And I would like to ask a question aimed at the EU level, let's say. So with some EU, mainly German and French politicians arguing for a more, let's say, muscular response from the European Union to the competitive threats from China and the United States. In this eagerness to push against economic nationalism in China and the United States, it seems like the EU politicians have started advocating some sort of a new, like a brand of economic nationalism. So with, for example, the Germans' new National Industrial Strategy 2030, promoting national and European champions, even when it hurts the competition within the EU. So now, from the legal perspective, I would like to ask for your take on EU's engagement in such policies that, you know, for the sake of a muscular reaction to China or the United States, would threaten the underpinning prosperity in the EU. So what should the EU's policies be focused on to regulate this matter and, you know, further promote economic growth? I hope I was clear.
Yes, so the question is for Mr. Parenti, I guess, mostly?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's suitable, yeah.
Yes, so I give the floor to Mr. Parenti for answering, and then after Mr. Parenti, if one of our speakers wants to add something from also to this question, we have only this question to answer, and then we can consider closing our conference. I do apologize if I have to leave before everybody speaks. I am in urgent need to go to another conference where my student is discussing her thesis. So I have to be in the commission in a few minutes. Thank you very much, Arman, for your question. Now the floor to Mr. Parenti to answer to this question.
Thank you very much. I think it's a question which probably may deserve another webinar at least in order to answer it. It's quite complex. What I honestly believe is there are different ways of responding to this. One is copy and paste, if you want, which is indeed try to pursue the creation of European champions and unleash those champions worldwide. There is a little bit of a trouble with all of this. One is the catching up, of course. I mean, we won't be able to create a new Huawei from in 2 days, or a new Amazon in a couple of weeks or year. So we will have to be looking at different areas where actually a lot of European companies are already very competitive. I can think in construction, I can think in transport, even in the food area. The other question is, or the other approach is maybe the one of upholding our competition policies and try to push for a more out of externalization, out of boundary use of our competition policies, and ask for other, I mean, and control the growth of foreign champions in Europe and outside Europe. I think that there's no way around those problems without, and I think Professor Schott was very clear on this a moment ago, without a definition of international rules, possibly at the WTO. We need to go back to the WTO at a certain point to avoid a total fall under nationalism in terms of economics. Between the two options presented, it's difficult to say which one is preferable. I give you my own personal preferences, the second one. I'm a little bit skeptical of creating champions on specific recipes. If they don't start up themselves, I think we risk to create more problem than solving them if we actually propose or define one or two champions. This having said, Airbus, which is an European champion, is possibly something that one should consider as a good counter argument to my discussion.
Thank you. Does any of the speakers want the microphone? No, we cannot hear you, Alberto.
Okay.
Yes.
If I may add something to this topic, I'm very pleased with what Antonio said, because one of the concerns I had, and I wrote a chapter actually in my book about is this temptation of a new European sort of nationalism in some respect that was which would betray the true nature of European Union. But we read the political priorities of this commission. We heard a discussion about technological sovereignty, which is fine. But then, we have now a white paper about the subsidies from third party, in the case of investment from third parties in Europe. There is the new framework for screening of foreign investments. I'm worried that all these will lead to something which eventually might bring us to a more, well, not simply competition, which is fine, but to some confrontation. I think Europe should pursue a different, obviously, different path. We should not obviously be, there should be a fair play everywhere. We should have countries that do not respect the rules, the standards multilaterally set to comply with. But there is a fine line, and I'm not sure whether it's clear on which side of the boundaries Europe wants to stay. But I'm very comforted in hearing what Antonio said, and I hope that will be the line. That will be the what Europe will do. But there should be. My wording is we should look at this. It's not necessarily it's something which was impossible to even think about in Europe a few years ago. Now it's possible. We are here. We could do a webinar, as Antonio said. So that tells a lot. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for all of your answers. I see Mr. Quercia has already left the webinar. I would like to thank all the participants and all the students for their interventions, and thank you again, everybody, and we will see you hopefully again in the new editions of the festival.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.